Beginnings are hard. Whether you're writing something as mundane as an email or something much more major like a thesis or dissertation, or even just developing a new habit, oftentimes the most difficult part of just about any process is those first steps. On this episode of Learning and Leisure, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why beginnings can be so difficult and develop a shared tool chest of strategies that you can implement in your own daily lives in order to overcome the challenges associated with beginnings. Let's get started. Oftentimes, I feel like the things that motivate us to either act or not act can be categorized into about two major groups: wants and fears. And these two are very interrelated and bleed into one another. For example, take one of the most common things that can stop you from releasing those projects that you're working on out into the public, or just in general, stopping and declaring something as finished: perfectionism. Perfectionism is a want on one hand, right? It is the desire for something to be perfect or exactly as you imagined it in your imagination. But really, if you think about it, on the other hand, it's very closely related to something like a fear of failure. And so perfectionism can lead you to both act and overact, right? Constantly working at something and never declaring it finished because it's never quite living up to your envisioned perfect ideal form of this thing. But on the other hand, it can also be equally paralyzing at the very beginning and stopping you from actually taking those steps towards those goals because you might feel like any attempt that you make will never live up to the standard that you have established for yourself from the start. And so perfectionism is tough. Perfectionism is very difficult, but thankfully, there are strategies that you can implement, very practical ones. And so I think one of the first and most useful things when dealing with perfectionism is to think about a process over a product, right? Especially in the early stages of developing something, you really want to emphasize that this is part of a process. We very often are faced with looking at things as their final drafts, right? When you go see a movie, you see the final cut. When you hear a song, then it's always that last cut, unless it's a Beatles one, and then there's going to be a remastering in about 20 years. But at the same time, you're constantly facing the final drafts of things, even best-selling novels, right? You're always reading the last one. But how often do you get to peer into all the iterations that came before that last piece? We very often ignore and forget that these results come from years sometimes of practice and development, right? When you see a professional athlete out on the field, again, it's years and years and years of practice leading up to this game-changing moment. When you're just starting out on some new habit or project, it's really important to think about this process as something that is going to take time, right? Being realistic with yourself about that fact and thinking of it as not as something that has to get done perfectly on that first try, but as part of a larger process. I think one really great writer who nailed this subject is Lamott. She has a great book on writing called Bird by Bird. And even though it's about writing, I think it can be very useful to think about just about anything you are trying to start doing in terms of first drafts and iterations coming after that. So in one of her most famous chapters, she writes, "Almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting something, anything, down on paper. A friend of mine says that the first draft is the down draft. You just get it down. The second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. And the third draft is the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose or cramped or decayed, or even, God help us, healthy." And again, this is primarily about writing, but I think what's so useful about Lamott's formulation is really thinking of things in terms of drafts or in terms of a process that is ongoing, and thinking of each step along the way as serving a very particular purpose, right? So for her, that first draft is the downdraft. You're just trying to jump into the water in this case, right? You're just getting started. You're taking a feel for this new endeavor, and you are getting a sense of how you are reacting to this new space. And so from there, once you have established yourself in this sphere, then you can begin to work at developing those skills further and working towards, if it's a product, right, getting towards that final product. If it's a habit, then getting into developing a very sustainable kind of routine. For example, like if you're working on a new workout method, right? Thinking in terms of, okay, on Monday I'm going to do cardio, and I'm going to do it at this time of the day because I'm most likely going to stick with it at this time. These are all things that we're going to talk about over the course of this podcast. But at the beginning, if perfectionism is something that is stopping you, right, or a very potent kind of feeling that you have that you need to work through, then the first thing I would recommend is to think about it in terms of process over product, especially at the beginning. Another thing that you can think about is a sort of, I guess, iOS mentality. And what I mean by that is a lot of software gets released out into the public at a certain version, right? With iPhones, it's the iOS software of, let's say, 18.2.1, right? There was a 17 before that, a 16, a 15, all the way back to 1. Apple didn't nail their software on that first try, but they did create something that was good enough to be released that they then tweak over time, right? Once you have started something, you're going to start understanding what kind of challenges you're going to be facing, what sort of obstacles are going to come into your way, and you then work through them. And so having something that is just good enough at the beginning is going to get you in the habit of thinking in the kind of way that you need to think in order to be productive in this sort of space. But it's also going to help you to begin developing certain habits, understanding what the world around you is like in the sphere that you're working in. And so think of things as just good enough, right? You can always fix it later. Of course, this is easier said than done, right? I can bring out 100 different examples of things like Anne Lamott's chapter. It's called Shitty First Drafts, by the way, but I really recommend the whole book. It's very fascinating and really has helped me a lot in my own writing and in my own habit developing practices. But I think really developing something practical is, of course, a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult to put this into action than to just say, okay, I'm going to start thinking about it as a process. Much easier said than done. But again, if you are faced with perfectionism, one way to really, I think, deal with perfectionism really effectively is to make the process as unserious and as silly as possible from the beginning. And what I mean by this is, for example, I have to write a lot, right? I'm currently in an English PhD program, and I'm currently working on a dissertation. And so for this project, what has really helped me is to make it unserious. And what I do is I open Google Docs or I open Microsoft Word, depending on what I'm working in that day. And I set, this is going to sound crazy, but I set my font to something that's not Times New Roman or one of those kind of default ones that I kind of associate with polished and, kind of published professional writing. So I set it to something like Georgia, which to me is like the playful Times New Roman. It's just a little bit somehow more warm and inviting of a font. Then I set the font color to red, and I set my all caps on. And so when I'm typing away on my first drafts, it really sounds and looks like I'm screaming at my computer a little bit. So I just kind of go, it somehow feels a lot more informal to me. I'm just kind of speaking at the computer. I'm using informal language. I'm not writing in total, full, complete, and logical sentences. It's sort of all over the place. But really, I'm just trying to work through, like, imagine if you turned on a faucet somewhere in the countryside for the first time in years, right? And all this muck and gunk is coming out at the beginning. And over time, as the sink is running, the faucet starts getting out clear water. That's really what I'm trying to do with the first draft. I'm just getting through the muck. And so I'm typing in this all caps red font, and I'm using incomplete sentences, and maybe I'm saying, oh, bring this in, or talk about this. I'm not even actually talking about the thing. I'm just giving myself directions on where to go from there. And then once I have done that, then I go back and I set the font back to something like Times New Roman, black, and regular cases. And then I work through what I already have. And it's so much less intimidating by this point because I have something that I'm working with. And that first one, it's just goofy. It's absolutely ridiculous if you look at them. Hopefully, no one will ever see those first drafts because they're absolutely embarrassing. But they help me get through and start just thinking through the problems that I have to solve. And so then, as I'm working through it and I'm revising on that, like Lamott says, first the downdraft, then the updraft, I'm fixing it up. And what I'm going through is I'm basically erasing the parts that I've gone. And as I'm going with time and revising, that redness, it disappears, right? And what's being replaced is that nonsense with something that is far more logical and resembling human speech. And so I'm working through it, right? I'm evaporating that red sea of text, but I already had something that I'm working with. So, no matter what it is that you're doing, try to make it as unserious for yourself as possible. Try to make it as welcoming and inviting and really, frankly, silly. Truly, silliness can really help. It might feel very much like a waste of time at first as you're going through it, but believe me, it's far more productive to be doing something like this than to just be staring at that blank screen. And so it, in the end, is going to probably save you time. If you just get through that kind of first opening desire to be perfect on the first draft and just get something ridiculous out there in the beginning and work through it afterwards. One of the biggest fears that's very closely related to perfectionism, right? If perfectionism is the want or the desire to have this perfect result, then I'd say the underside of that would be the fear of failure. And a fear of failure, it's very potent as well because not only are you afraid, I'd say, of probably not succeeding, right? But you're also worried that some actual negative outcome is going to come from you embarking on this new journey, right? It's a lot more than just not succeeding. It's actually getting some kind of negative result from this. And so, in order to battle a certain fear of failure, one thing that you can do is to interrogate yourself. Think about the worst case scenario. Really think about, okay, I'm afraid of failing if I begin this thing. What does failure mean for me? What exactly is failure in this case? What would the worst case scenario be? Really, write it down, write through this problem. I find a lot of times when we actually put it down on paper, it becomes concrete. It becomes something that we can actually see because I think a lot of times fears are unrealized and unfully formed ideas or perceptions about potential outcomes. And so by actually writing this down, you're confronting these things head on and you see them spelled out. And from there, you can actually work through them and think about, okay, if this is the worst case scenario in this situation, what can I then do if that's where we end up? What can I do to fix that? And I think a lot of times, by actually interrogating yourself and thinking through what it exactly it is that you are afraid of failing and what failure means to you, then you're also making it known. And I think a fear of failure is very closely linked to another very big fear, which is the fear of the unknown. A lot of times when we're embarking on something new, we're being forced to step outside of our comfort zones, and that can be incredibly scary. And so the fear of the unknown can be sort of paralyzing because you think, well, I've never done this before, right? And from there, that can very easily start spiraling into that fear of failure. But if you make the fear of failure written down and you talk about, okay, these are the possible outcomes, you can then face them, you can then plan for them, that becomes known to you. And you can work through those issues. If you feel like the fear of the unknown is something that is stopping you from accomplishing something new, then I would highly recommend interviewing someone who has gone through the process before you, right? A lot of the things that we are doing aren't entirely novel. Someone has done them before, or something very similar, even if it's a little bit different in the scope or exact style that we intend on approaching it. There's always someone who came before us and a lot of people who came before them. So find that person that you have access to and talk to them. How did they go through this process? How did they begin? Maybe they encountered certain pitfalls that they hadn't anticipated. Just because they went through them doesn't mean you have to. So, even by going through this conversation with someone, you will be able to then start many steps ahead of where you might have started if you hadn't, because you'll have foreknowledge going into this process, knowing what some of the potential challenges might be. They also might be able to point you to some really great resources that'll help you. Let's say you don't have someone in your life that you have access to have this kind of conversation. Or maybe just interviewing isn't really your style. Or maybe they give you answers that don't seem particularly helpful. In any case, regardless of whether or not you do this kind of interviewing, I highly, highly recommend that if you have a fear of the unknown when it comes to starting something new, the single greatest thing that you can do for yourself is to consider the ways in which this new thing is similar to things that you have done in the past. A lot of the things that we're doing aren't totally new, right? It's very rare that you are going to find yourself in a situation where it is totally and wholly unfamiliar to you. So, think about it. In my case, I'm currently working on a dissertation. And so I have never written a dissertation before, but I have done things and I have developed skills over my time as a student that are going to help me for this project. For example, I have conducted research. I have found useful sources and I've cited those sources. I have written essays and drafts of articles and seminar papers that, while in some ways they are different genres from a dissertation chapter, they're still sustained and pretty decently long pieces of writing that are similar in many ways. They ask you to, evaluate sources, to synthesize ideas. These are all things that I've already done. So while the dissertation as a genre on its own might feel unfamiliar to me, I can read past dissertations that have been written by others and get a sense of it, but I'm also coming in with an existing tool chest that is going to help me to complete this project. And really, so it's not 100% of the project that is totally new. Maybe there's 20% or 25% of that actual thing that is new to me, that I can focus my efforts on, but I already have a list of things that I'm coming in with. And again, I really recommend writing these things down, making them tangible to you. Seeing them in a list will really help boost your confidence as you go forward. But not only that, but it's also going to help you by having established these bridges and these precedents for the kinds of things that you're going to be doing. It's going to be helpful for not only overcoming these anxieties about beginning, but it's also going to be incredibly helpful for you when you make your plan, because then you're going to be able to have an established foundation and an understanding of your own working rhythms, right? And how you've done maybe similar things in the past, how long they have taken you, the things that have been most challenging about those processes, the things that you excelled at, right? All these things are going to allow you to then optimize your plan going forward for this new project, which is going to be the subject of our next episode of Learning and Leisure, where we talk about making sustainable working rhythms that are going to allow you to incrementally work towards your goals and to build in certain stopgaps and safety measures that are going to help you when things get tough. Because, frankly, sometimes they just do. So, tune in to our next episode. Thank you all for your listening and take care.